In this video you will learn how to play with black to combat the Maroczy system. Destroy your opponents and win more games. The Maroczy structure is a typical structure, which is also called Maroczy Bind because white puts a lot of pressure and black finds it difficult to release his position. It is a characteristic structure of the accelerated dragon variation in the Sicilian defense, although it can also be produced from other openings and can also be produced with changed colors. Its main characteristic is that white has two pawns placed on the fourth rank, on e4 and c4, and has changed his queen pawn. White has a space advantage and has good control over the d5 and b5 squares, so it is not easy for black to free himself by making these breaks. Furthermore, if the c4 pawn is well defended, black will have a harder time creating counterplay along the c-file. White can place a knight on d5, with the idea of dominating the game. If the knight is changed, a favorable structure for white can be reached. While if black tries to expel the white knight from the d5 square by playing e6, then the d6 pawn will be very weak since it is placed on a semi-open file. Black's general plan to free his position is to attack one of the pawns on the fourth rank and try to free his play. The most effective plans for black are: change pieces to alleviate space problems, break on the queen side preparing to break with b5, to attack against the c4 pawn, break on the king side with f5 and attack against the enemy king, press on the queen side with queen b6, attacking against the b2 pawn. In case of b3, black can continue with a5, a4, a3, with the idea of capturing on b3 and creating weaknesses in the opponent's field. Attack in the center with e6 and d5. For its part, white has several plans at its disposal. Advance with the pawns on the queen side to gain space in that area. Advance with the pawns on the king side. Break in the center with f4 and e5. Place a knight on square d5. If black captures the knight, a favorable pawn structure would be reached, both after e takes d5 and with c takes d5. Next we are going to study a very instructive game in which we will see how to play against the Maroczy system and you will learn which pieces you have to change and which pieces you have to keep. White began the game with the move e4, placing a pawn in the center. Black replied c5, using the Sicilian defense. Black's idea is to control the d4 square, to prevent white from occupying the center with his pawns. White played knight f3, developing the king's knight and taking control of the d4 square. White's plan is to occupy the center with d4 and, if black captures the white pawn, then be able to recapture with the knight. Knight c6, developing the queen's knight and increasing control over the d4 square. d4, occupying the center with his pawns. C takes d4. Eliminating the opponent's central pawn and exchanging it for a lateral pawn, leaving black with a central majority of pawns. g6. With the idea of developing the king's bishop on the g7 square, where it will be very well placed, since it will occupy the large diagonal of dark squares and will exert pressure on the center and the queen side. Now, white played c4. Gaining space on the queen side, increasing control over the d5 square and establishing the Maroczy structure. Black played knight f6. Developing the king's knight and threatening to capture the e4 pawn. Knight c3. Developing the queen's knight and defending the e4 pawn. Now black captured the knight on d4. Eliminating the opponent's central knight. As we have already mentioned before, it is in black's best interest to exchange pieces to alleviate his space problems. Furthermore, by exchanging knights on d4 early, they forced the opposing queen into the open field, where she could be left vulnerable. d6. Taking control over the e5 square, to prevent the white pawn from continuing to advance. At the same time, black releases the action to the bishop on c8 and takes control of the g4 square. White played bishop e2. Developing the king's bishop, taking control of the g4 square and preparing to castle. Black answered bishop g7. Developing the king's bishop, targeting the opposing queen and preparing to castle. White played bishop e3. Completing the development of his minor pieces and preparing to retreat the queen to the d2 square, where she will be safer. Black castled, putting his king in safety, defending the bishop on g7 and threatening knight g4, which would give black an advantage. White answered queen d2. Removing the queen to a safer square and removing it from the opposing bishop's line of attack, to avoid any possible discover attack. Black played queen a5. Activating the queen and preparing to create counterplay on the queen side. White played f3. Connecting the pawns and reinforcing the defense of the e4 pawn. Normally, white has to make this move sooner or later to reinforce his position in the center. The problem with this move is that he places another pawn on a light-colored square and the bishop on e2 is a bad bishop since it is crashing into its own pawns. Black played bishop e6. Completing the development of his minor pieces and beginning to press against the c4 pawn. White responded rook c1. Activating the queen rook, bringing it closer to the central files. Furthermore, with this move, white removes his rook from the line of attack of the bishop on g7, which will allow him to make the move b3, to reinforce the pawn on c4, without the danger of autopining along the large diagonal of dark squares. Black played rook f to c8. Activating the king's rook, increasing the pressure against the c4 pawn and threatening to capture it. White played b3. Strengthening the defense of the c4 pawn and freeing up the second rank, so that the queen defends the a2 pawn and white will be able to move his knight in the future. Now black played a6. Taking control of the b5 square, with the idea of preparing the break with b5 and freeing his position. If white now castles, black can respond with b5 and obtain good counterplay. For example, black has a clear advantage. Black has an advantage due to his better pawn structure. In the game, after a6, white played a4. Increasing control over the b5 square, to avoid the b5 break by the opponent. The problem with this move is that the black squares have been weak on the queen side and the b3 pawn has been left behind, so is a backward pawn and may be vulnerable. Black played knight d7. Maneuvering with the knight, with the idea of taking it towards the c5 square, to attack against the b3 pawn, which is a weakness in white's camp. Now, surely the correct plan for white was knight d5. After the exchange of queens and the exchange of pieces on d5, black can continue with bishop b2, attacking the enemy rook, with the idea of taking control of the open file. After rook c4, bishop a3. White can play rook b1, threatening to follow with b4, to trap the enemy bishop. Black can respond with a5. Increasing control over the b4 square. White keeps the bishop pair, but black has good control over the dark squares on the queen side and has a good game. In the game, however, white played bishop g5, attacking the e7 pawn. But this move is actually a mistake. Black responded knight c5. Activating the knight and threatening to capture the b3 pawn, which would create a double attack against the queen and the rook. Knight d5 is not good now. Because black exchanges queens, then captures on d5 and finally captures the b3 pawn and is left with an advantage. In the game, white played bishop d1, to defend the b3 pawn and avoid the opponent's threat. Black answered rook c7, defending the e7 pawn and threatening to continue with queen b4, to invade with the queen through the weak squares in the enemy camp and increase the pressure against the b3 pawn. Now it would be a mistake to castle for white, since black captures on b3 and after the bishop takes b3. Queen b6 check, black recovers the piece and has the advantage. In the game white played knight d5, occupying a strong position in the center with the knight. With this move white removes his knight from the line of attack of the bishop on g7, increases the pressure against the pawn on e7 and frees the action to his queen, so that he threatens to change queens to simplify the position and facilitate the defense. But this move is actually a mistake and allows black to take the advantage. Now, black played knight d3 check, a good intermediate move that takes advantage of the opposing queen's pin along this diagonal. Black is going to gain material. The game continued king f1. Queen takes d2. Bishop takes d2. Bishop takes d5, eliminating the enemy knight in the center, before capturing the c1 rook. Black has won the exchange but white retains the bishop pair and seems to have good defensive options. However, now black played b5. Good move, to break against the opponent's pawn chain and open lines to activate the rooks to invade the enemy camp. It is not possible to capture on b5 because black's rooks will invade the enemy position and black would win. In the game, white played bishop e2, trying to defend his pawn chain. Black captured on a4. And after bishop d4, black activates his bishop, takes control of a good diagonal. White played g3, trying to castle artificially. Black played rook b8, with the idea of invading the enemy camp with the rook. White played king g2. And after rook b4. The black rook invades the opponent's field and threatens to capture the opponent's weaknesses. White played rook d1, activating the rook and threatening to capture the opposing bishop. Black defended his bishop. And after a5, to defend the pawn. Black played rook a4 and white resigned. White can try to defend his pawn with bishop d2, but black would play rook b7, with the idea of invading with his other rook. Black can continue with moves like rook a2 rook b2 and has a decisive advantage.